The United States of America had an involved foreign policy throughout the late 70s to the 90s, and often acted to ensure stability and safety for the economy and society. Most instances where this was shown was intervening in the lack of freedom abroad.
This is seen especially through the Camp David Accords in 1978, which America became involved in to protect its allies and in order to avoid a bigger war. It was also seen in the Iran hostage crisis from 1979 to 1981, which was a conflict due to America's involvement in the Iranian government. And it is also seen in the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, which was an effect of the Cold War. All were instances where issues abroad could have affected America in a negative way, and where our involvement was for the interests of peace, both abroad and on the home front.
Perhaps the most involved foreign policy of this era was the Camp David Accords. This agreement between Egypt and Israel ended the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War was fought between Egypt and Syria and Israel. It was fought because the Arab countries of Egypt and Syria wanted land taken from them when Israel was formed. Egypt wanted Sinai, and Syria wanted Golan Heights. These countries had refused to work out a peace agreement with Israel regarding the issue. This incident almost caused a global war, as the United States was supplying Israel and the Soviet Union was giving weapons to Egypt. Although the Soviet Union was more powerful than Egypt, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev told U.S. President Nixon that he had lost control of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched their attacks. This resulted in a 2-year war. Although there was a ceasefire enacted by the UN, it was broken by Egyptian and Israeli forces. The war ended with the Camp David Accords. Jimmy Carter saw the fighting, and as an ally of Israel, tried to stop it. While Syria refused to negotiate for peace talks, President Sadat and new Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin began peace talks, but Mr. Rabin was soon replaced by Menachem Begin. These talks were in Geneva, and the foreign ministers attended, not the heads of state of their respective countries. President Sadat realized that the Geneva talks were not working well, and decided to remedy the situation himself. He told the Egyptian parliament that he wished to speak before the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. He was invited to do so and went to Israel, where he spoke about how peace could be achieved and the Palestinian refugee problem could be solved. While the US and Russia wanted to continue the Geneva talks, Sadat and Begin realized the talks would not get them anywhere, so they arranged with Jimmy Carter to do talks face-to-face, and Jimmy Carter suggested Camp David for the location. The talks began with the Egyptian Sadat and Israeli Begin talking face-to-face. The talks lasted for 13 days and were very tense. These talks lasted from September 5th to September 17th of 1978. At times, leaders of both countries wanted to end the negotiations, but Jimmy Carter lured them back. Thank heavens for Jimmy Carter. While the parties did work out an agreement, the United Nations rejected it because it did not meet their guidelines. The agreement, called the Framework for Peace in the Middle East, had 3 parts. The first part stipulated that the regions of West Bank and Gaza would be released from Israeli military control, and the inhabitants would participate in democratic elections. This would take place in a 5-year transition period. The second part stipulated that the countries of Egypt, Jordan, and Israel must agree to the terms of a new Palestinian government's creation. The third part stipulated that the countries of Israel, Egypt, and Jordan would get together at the end of this 5-year period to decide the fate of the territories of West Bank and Gaza. A peace treaty must be negotiated between Israel and Jordan. The negotiations would take place between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and the inhabitants of the Palestinians. There was then a second framework between Egypt and Israel stipulating the fate of the Sinai Peninsula. It stated that the Sinai Peninsula would belong to Egypt as long as it normalized diplomatic relations with Israel. It did not put their military too close to the border of the two countries. The United States would provide billion-dollar annual subsidies and military weaponry to Egypt and Israel, which continues today. The agreement got Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin the Nobel Peace Prize. It also earned Anwar Sadat a grenade blast and 37 rounds of automatic assault rifle fire, and soon after, a painful death. This came from a radical Islamic group called the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Also, because of the peace agreements, the United Arab Front against Israel collapsed, ending decades of extreme tension. Had America not stepped in to help the peace agreement, war and a probable Egyptian defeat would have occurred, which would have led to a large Arab versus Israeli war. This is a great example of America's involved foreign policy in an attempt to stop a bigger war.
Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
On November 4th, 1979, the U.S. Embassy located in Tehran was stormed by a group of angry Iranian revolutionaries who took hostage 66 Americans. They were held hostage for 444 days and were released almost a year after capture. The conflict between Iran and America began decades before due to tensions about oil. At this time, British and American corporations owned a large amount of Iran's petroleum reserves, which was very profitable for them. However, in 1951, when nationalist Mohammad Mossadegh was elected prime minister, he planned on nationalizing Iran's oil industry. Discontent with this idea, the American CIA and the British intelligence secretly planned to overthrow Mossadegh for a leader who would encourage Western interests. The operation was called Operation TP Ajax. The new leader was Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. He was anti-communist and pro-Western. He exchanged 80% of American and British oil resources for tens of millions of dollars of foreign aid. Growing discontent with the Shah's government led the people to follow radical cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and his revolutionary Islamist movement. In July of 1979, the revolutionists forced the Shah to abandon the government and flee to Egypt. The Shah was suffering from advanced malignant lymphoma and seek treatment in the U.S. President Carter reluctantly agreed to offer treatment in the U.S. as a humanitarian matter, not political. Carter did not want to create tension with the Middle East, but because of this, anti-American movements increased heavily. The revolutionaries took 66 American hostages, but 13 were released shortly after capture. Most of the hostages were diplomats and embassy employees. The hostages were never seriously hurt, but were treated poorly. They were blindfolded and taken in front of crowds and filmed on TV. They could not speak or read and usually could not even change their clothes. In response to the hostage situation, Carter attempted a number of diplomatic strategies, which he believed took too long. Finally, the president launched Operation Eagle Claw, which would send an elite rescue team into the embassy. The mission was aborted after 8 American servicemen died after a helicopter crash from a malfunction caused by a severe desert sandstorm. For Carter, the effects of the Iran hostage crisis stretched far beyond the 444 days of captivity. His incapability to rescue the hostages and the increased media coverage made President Carter look like a weak leader and caused him to lose the 1980 election to Republican Ronald Reagan. A few hours after Reagan gave his inaugural address, the hostages were released from captivity. The Iran hostage crisis was largely due to America's involved foreign policy. We acted in our own self-interest of protecting the American economy by trying to keep our oil reserves. After conflict erupted with the hostage crisis, we attempted to improve diplomatic relations in order to bring a solution to the crisis. I said Iran.
Hi, I'm Edward Colbert.
How old were you when the Iran hostage crisis began?
I was about 17. I think I was a senior in high school.
What was it like on the home front?
I think in the United States, things were very tense at the time. The economy was not doing well. President Carter was not very popular. Tensions around the world were high. And I think overall it was termed a general malaise.
What was your initial reaction to the hostage crisis?
I was a supporter of President Carter, Jimmy Carter at the time, and I knew this was going to be a tough situation for the president. It was going to put his re-election chances in jeopardy, and it was disappointing to me, certainly from a standpoint of a foreign nation taking hostages in such a vicious way, and really nothing we could do about it.
Do you believe that the situation could have been avoided?
It's hard to say. I know that President Carter did everything he could, probably one of our strongest diplomatic presidents to provide peace, but he didn't show a sign of strength, and he didn't come at it from strength, he came at it from diplomacy.
On Christmas Day of 1991, 11 of the 15 Soviet republics, the Ukraine, the Russian Federation, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan split up into separate nations. After the three Baltic nations had already declared their independence, this marked the end of the infamous Soviet Union. The Soviet Union formed in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution. A communist nation was formed after the Tsar was overthrown. The nation promised to be a society of true democracy, but the single-party communist rule and dictatorship led to many feeling as oppressed as they did prior to the revolution, especially during Joseph Stalin's rule. After the end of World War II and Joseph Stalin's reign, the Soviet Union began to focus more on the arms race and became less totalitarian. In 1985, a communist politician by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev promised to bring the nation to a more productive and powerful state. He introduced a policy of political openness known as glasnost. New freedoms were given to citizens, such as being able to express negative views of the government in newspapers. For the first time, members of the USSR were also allowed to vote, and they were able to vote for different parties. He also created reforms in economics, as the economy was struggling after the oil crisis of 1979 to 1982. This was called perestroika, and it loosened the governmental control over the economy. Gorbachev also loosened the communist rule on the nations of Eastern Europe. Gorbachev's economic reforms allowed more private businesses and created more market economy-like systems. However, this change in economics caused shortages and poverty. Gorbachev worked for a policy of non-intervention in order to strengthen ties with the U.S. and other countries. He even pulled troops out of Afghanistan. The end of the strict communist rule slowly led to a democratic revolution throughout Eastern Europe, starting with Poland and eventually leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall. One by one, each of the USSR's republics declared their independence. Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, and Boris Yeltsin took his place as president of the independent Russian state. Today, the president of Russia is Vladimir Putin. The fall of the Soviet Union was partially due to the strict foreign policy that America had put in place during the Cold War, due to the power struggle that it had with the communist nation. Our economic embargo on the Soviet Union weakened their economy and called for a change in the USSR's economic and governmental systems, which led to the democratic. In conclusion, these three events show that America's foreign policy during the time was in the interest for safety and peace in America.